My name is Ernie Badway, and I want to welcome everybody to Thompson Hine's Investment Management Coffee Chat webinar series. I'm a partner in the Business Lit and Investment Management practice groups, and we are delighted to have you with us today for today's session as part of our ongoing Securities Coffee Chat series. These coffee chats are designed to provide a concise, practical discussion on the latest hot topics and trends impacting the financial services industry. Today's session, which we are so excited about because it's so topical, is When the Firewall Fails, Cybersecurity and Compliance in a Connected World. Despite what you may be reading about and everything, the SEC is still focused on cybersecurity, as is other regulators such as the Department of Justice in the various states. And they're focusing in on BDs and RIAs and funds who are facing increasing pressure to make sure that their cybersecurity defenses are in place, to prepare for incidences, and unfortunately sometimes to respond to them with this very complex disclosure and compliance obligation structure that we have. Our panelists today, and frankly throughout this coffee chat series, are here to provide a practical discussion on the regulatory, operational, and reputational challenges many firms face today when their firewall fails, and the strategies employed to address them. So we are so excited to be here today, and more importantly, for me at least, I'm so excited that I can introduce this amazing panel. Really just a wonderful opportunity first to introduce my colleague and our counsel at Thompson Hine, Kimberly Pack, in our Privacy AI group, and Frank Brennan, who is an Associate Director of Forensics Incident Response at P&G Cyber. One item that I want everybody to be aware before we start getting into our topic is this is all about a conversation. It's about you speaking with us. We're looking forward to any questions that you may have. Please ask those questions. That's why we're here. We will get to them, and those questions that we don't get to, I can promise you, Kimberly and Frank will respond to them after this session. But we try very hard to get to them during the session. So please jump in, use the chat button, excuse me, on the WebEx system, and we really, really look forward to answering those questions. Now, of course, just as it begins, my voice decides to take a little hiatus. Normally I would blame the summer, but it's 70 degrees outside in August, so I'm not sure that I can call that the summer. Maybe early fall. In any event, let's sort of get into our topics today, and talking about our situation here. We're going to talk first about the current status of the rules and disclosure obligations, what's required now and in the near future. We're going to talk about cyber incident response planning, as well as exercises for cyber preparedness. We're then going to talk about vendor risk management and third-party breaches. Keep in mind, that's one of the critical areas right now that many companies seemingly still have not addressed, and we're going to talk about that today. And then we're going to finish up talking a couple of topics involving the SEC, as well as other data privacy laws relating to cybersecurity, as well as GDPR and CCPA as well. So without further ado, let's begin. So Kimberly, what do you think are the key requirements to take away from the SEC's cybersecurity rule structure?
So I want to hone in on something you said. So the SEC in 22 had proposed some specific rules for registered investment advisors that would have been more stringent and more in line with some of the stuff I'm going to talk about for big companies. But back in June, without any explanation, right, they withdrew those proposals. But I think this is still timely because that does not change anything for most of our organizations that we support, because you still have ongoing responsibilities and obligations to have written procedures and processes for protecting the data in which you have. And so there's four big main buckets that I'll talk about. First is the
Kimberly, before you get into the buckets, I think it's a really important point, before you get into the buckets, to say that, here, that please don't take, no one should take away from this session that just because the SEC didn't pass those rules, that they have no obligations. I think that's really critical to make a.
Absolutely. You still have obligations. If you have personal data, you have obligations, right? And so really what these rules, these newer rules were really getting down to specifying how you're reporting, what you're reporting. It required things that are somewhat best practices that many firms who are looking to be compliant in this space are already doing. So the first one I want to talk about is the SEC so-called corporate cybersecurity rule. And that's the one for the big companies that if you happen to be a registered investment advisor that's also large and publicly traded, there's some requirements to, of course, protect, but to disclose. And so this disclosure would take place, and it's, I believe it became required as of last year, on the 8K, where you would disclose any cybersecurity incident that was material, right? And here it was really to get clear in a concise, consistent way for investors to be able to understand and know what the risks were that these organizations that they're looking to invest in or that they are investors in are facing. And so if you have to comply with that rule, you also had a new regulation, SK, where you actually had to describe your processes for assessing and identifying, managing material risk related to cybersecurity threats. And so those are for large companies. I think there was a lot of scuttlebutt leading up to the passage of it. I think we've seen that. I think a lot of companies see that it's not as bad as it could have been. I think some of the things that the SEC compromised on around the timing, around being able to describe the processes versus actually loading up your procedures, because there was a lot of concern about, companies giving a roadmap to cyber criminals, right, around how they fight and address these things. But it is true that plaintiffs' counsel and folks are looking when we do make these decisions that that the incident threat is material, that's something that's happened that is material. There's always risk associated with that. So we make the disclosure risk, but now we have to deal with the fallout of people seeing it, knowing it, and maybe some of the lawsuits that may come, and they do come. But I do think it's important we'll get to materiality after this, but that's for the big companies. And I think there were a lot of companies that felt like because they're not large, they're good. But there's still Regulation SP, which for folks, that generally had a requirement for the last 25 years. It's the 25th year for Regulation SP, so it's been with us for a while. This year is its birthday. And it generally has broker-dealers, investment companies, and investment advisors to adopt written policies and procedures that address administrative, technical, and physical safeguards for protection of customer records and information. And so that's something that we are adhering to today, and that's really what's driving a lot of folks who aren't, again, publicly traded companies that requires them to have these written policies and procedures. But we know that amendments to the SP, to Regulation SP has been passed, and that for larger institutions, these new amendments are going to take place and be effective. You have to comply with by December 3rd of 2025. So the smaller companies, they have a little more time. They don't have to apply to June 3rd, but basically the amendments to Regulation SP makes it very clear that a covered entity has to have an incident response program. And I think most of the folks we talk to, you probably already have one, but this is really mandating it and prescribing it as a requirement. So you must develop and maintain an incident response program to detect, respond to, and recover from unauthorized access to customer information. It gives a breach notification where institutions would be required to report and notify to affected individuals 30 days after detecting a data breach involving sensitive customer information. And it also has specific service provider oversight where, there was some compromise on exact language that the contract would have, but it's really still saying institutions must establish and maintain policies to make sure they're overseeing and monitoring service providers with access to sensitive customer information. And of course, it is also requiring record keeping in line with safeguards rules. And these amendments, again, had a long tail. There was 18 months for large organizations based on certain dollar amounts that's held. And so those will come into play December 3rd, and then for others, January 3rd, because there was a 24-month lag. And if that's not enough, right? If you are one of these covered entities that has these accounts, the surge accounts that are subject to regulation SID, where that's the identity theft red flags rules, that's where if you have a certain type of account that you manage, that you also have to be able to have detection around identity theft, which is very prevalent, and being able to detect that, to suppress it, to keep folks from taking unauthorized access to a customer's accounts. So those are just 4 things. And then you always are a fiduciary. And so you always, as a fiduciary, have to report and disclose those things, that material to your organization that impacts your operations, the finances, whatever those things that are material. So without all of this, if something big happened, you would already have an obligation to report as a fiduciary, and always having to disclose material incidents related to the firm.
Well, Kimberly, you said the dirty word, materiality. How do you go about determining what's material? Like, for example, from my perspective, is it material that MLB.com, where I have an account, they release the fact that I'm a huge Boston Red Sox fan? Is that?
So no, that's not, as you know, but it is really broad, and it really is a fact determination exercise that institutions, when they have an incident, have to be prepared to do. So materiality is literally very broad. It's about substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor will consider it important, or that the information will significantly alter the total mix of information made available. And so I think what's really important when we start thinking about how to prepare for an incident and around materiality is that you have the right people at the table. Do you know now who your CISO is? Who are the people who will help determine what those are? Who is aware of the incident and its impact, and quickly assessing what that impact is to make that determination? Because again, for the public companies that have to adhere to the SEC cybersecurity rule, you have 4 days, 4 business days once you determine that it is material. So this is something that needs to move swiftly. And just because it's about only material doesn't mean we get to drag our feet around it, because the government, the regulator, will do a look back. And when all that information that was there and present, and which you actually determined that helped you determine that materiality was present at a certain date, that will be known and it will be realized. And so it is not an opportunity to delay making that decision in hopes to delay disclosure. So we want to be very timely around making those assessments around materiality, and making sure that the right people are in the room to help make that assessment and determination, and that you are gathering the facts around the impact of the incident in order to make that decision and to make the right decision.
And that's a great segue. Frank, why don't you tell us about the process, what you should consider sort of in addressing in an incident response plan, and stress tests, and like both legal and operational. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and like the exercises that are designed to assist in that situation?
No, absolutely. And I think it is a really good segue, because some of the things Kimberly was just discussing is exactly what you would want to then stress test during a exercise like a tabletop. But before you can get to a tabletop, you really have to have a plan in place. A lot of people will approach it one of 2 ways, right? They'll either just suffer through an incident without having a plan, then be like, oh gosh, now we need to make a plan. Or some folks will go, hey, this thing's going to happen, because I hate to break it to anyone out there, but it's not if it's going to happen, it's when at this point. The good guys have to get it right every day, every single time, and these clowns just have to get it right one time. And if they catch you sleeping that one time, I will tell you every time I get on a call with a client, man, if they had just hit us 2 weeks from now, we were just taking care of this one problem we knew we had. I don't know how they know, but they just do. So I leverage my military background in a lot of things, and this is one of them. When I start thinking about an incident response plan, is the first thing we're always going to try and do when we start determining that is figuring out the command and control. Who's going to be in charge of this thing once the shooting starts, whether it's going to be the CISO, whether it's going to be the chief operating officer, whether it's going to be in-house counsel, whether it's going to be a blend, and then determining what they're in charge of. This way you can combine those lineated dispersions of effort so that people can focus on what needs to be focused on. And then the next thing we're really going to talk about is the rules of engagement. What can you do and what can't you do? Whether it's related to counsel not wanting you to reach outside of the environment beforehand so that you can control the messaging, whether it's reaching out to regulators because there's a regulatory requirement based on a timeline, so understanding those rules of engagements on when which switches need to be pulled, and then making sure that that's laterally communicated across the organization really helps develop the initial footprint for this plan. Then you can go into the more technical side of things when you're talking about the situational awareness. What logs and metrics are you using within your environment and within your day-to-day operations to really determine if you're on a pathway to success or a pathway to failure? This way you can hopefully circumvent an incident and stop it before it becomes one. And then finally, you can't have a fight without logistics. So logistics really does kind of play into it when you're looking at any kind of pre-negotiated rates with vendors, understanding if you have any kind of IR retainers, if you have any kind of backup communication plans in place. If someone comes in and compromises your whole network, you might not want to be communicating on your internal emails across your C-suite to have these conversations while you bring on outside counsel, while you reach out to your insurance industries.
Frank, you just saved yourself. You mentioned outside counsel. Thank you so much. That's critical.
I can't ignore counsel when I'm on a phone call with y'all. So I had to include it, but Kimberly will attest to it. Many of the vendors in my space, it is a partnership and a team, and it really is trading off who's really running the show at the beginning versus the back end, because we're all bringing a different tool set to these engagements. And the more it's rehearsed, the better it performs. And that's really what we're going to line into that last step I do with an incident response plan. And that's really having an incident, an after action review or a rehearsal. And that's really where it comes into these more type of tabletop exercises, these more lifetime, talk throughs of an event, so that you can sit there and specifically, even if it's not a huge event in your organization, take advantage of, somebody clicking a bad link. Maybe the bad link didn't turn into something bad this time, but the next time that doesn't mean that's going to be the same situation. So just having a quick tabletop for 30 minutes internally with your team, really helps talking through, hey, what could this have led to? What could this have turned into? And then that allows you to kind of source that plan that you've already come up with and run it through the ringer before your hair is really on fire at 2 a.m.
And Frank, I can't agree with you more. It's absolutely the case. And sort of we're on the bad guys now. Could you tell us a little bit about, in your experience, how you would address, what we would characterize as, like, for example, best practice, low-hanging fruit, and how that interfaces with these actors. I will say one thing. The example you gave is so precise and on point. It reminds me, one time I'm getting gasoline one time, and I go to the same gas place. I'm a creature of habit. Same gas place all the time. And I had my my buds in my ear. I had just come from the gym, and I'm talking with the guy who I talk with all the time. And he says to me, he goes, do you like those? I need to get a new pair. And I go, yeah, they're not too bad and everything. I look down at my phone, and what's popping up on my phone, and mind you, I don't have those, like, things, always on and everything, the interactive, but what's popping up on my phone is like literally advertisements for earbuds. And like, I was like shocked. I couldn't believe it. And so, like, could you tell us about that sort of process and what's happened? Kimberly wants to jump in.
Frank, right before you go there, I want to just spend a little more time on this tabletop exercise.
Please.
I
was hoping you'd jump in.
Back to you I think the storytelling is really important, but I want to just hone in on the fact that some organizations may see tabletop exercises are just nice to have, but it is really important that you have robust tabletop exercises where you can walk away with, metrics around things. You have really good information. You know who you can contact. If you're a counsel, if you already have counsel engaged with our clients, we are participating in those. We are aiding them along. If you haven't thought about, if you have insurance, what those vendors are, because again, so Frank's already kind of highlighted this a little bit, but when the incident is going on, time is of the essence. And if you do not know who you can contact, if you don't already have your vendors lined up, trying to get an engagement letter around that stuff, trying to identify, vetting. It is late, you lose valuable time. And so it's really important. And I think the other thing I want to note is it's really important that those outside of the security organization participate. I think it is a miss for us to not have C-suite individuals. I know they're busy. I know it's hard to nail them down sometimes, but when we've had these with senior leaders, even if it wasn't the full 4 hours, if we did a 2-hour short one, it was really impactful because they started thinking about the things that, in the moment they would flub, things that they needed to walk away and think about the money that might be lost. If you don't have access to trading for a significant period of time, if you don't there's literally things that senior leaders will have to make a decision about. And if we don't take them through these exercises, we're just not setting them up to make really great leadership decisions around these incidents. And then the other thing is your employees. If things come offline, do you have your communications team standing by? Do they know? Do they already have scripts available? Do you already have things to talk to about your employees so they're not going on social media, alerting people to things that are taking place internally? So there's a lot of things to work through to be in the best position to weather and to go through the waves of an incident that's happening. So, Frank, now I'll throw it back to you. I just wanted to make sure I highlighted some of those things.
And just to put a fine point on what Kimberly is saying, let's face it, even CEOs have to go through their building fire drills. That there's a reason for doing it. So Kimberly's point is very well taken. Back to you, Frank. What do you think about this low-hanging fruit and everything?
No, I think that, you nailed some of it right there, and you can't address low-hanging fruit without knowing your baseline in that plan. Everyone knows about the tweet heard around the world, right? Where that one employee in finance wrote, "Oh yeah, locked out of all our systems, free day off work today." And now all of a sudden some tweet researcher is looking where she works at, and then suddenly sees that they can't take any, online card payments that day. And they put 3 and 3 together. And now all of a sudden, a team who's already dealing with a incident response from a technical perspective is now having to manage a external communication issue based on some communications that hadn't been managed prior to hand. So that is a really important part that, it's not just the C-suite and upper level management. It's got to be communicated all the way down. And then obviously the low-hanging fruit is how we stop this from potentially occurring, assuming that we're using and leveraging the best practices, but then taking those best practices and taking it a step forward. From Microsoft 365, we really want to take advantage of those conditional access policies. I think, 2 years ago, everyone would have screamed at you, you have to enforce and enable MFA. And many of the engagements we're dealing with today, they have enabled and enforced MFA, and yet folks are still being tricked. The threat actors are leveraging AI to make better phishing templates. They're leveraging AI to become better attackers. They're getting English speakers on their payrolls now to make these phone calls to pretend to be the external IT MSP that's supporting you in order to get their passwords and information. So making sure that, your employees understand threats are out there, and to always think it's a threat and to err on the side of caution to make that phone call before they execute anything else. No one should ever be asking for your password, whether it's an internal or external vendor. If they need a password entered, they're going to tell you to enter it. And an email should typically never be asking you to enter a password. And before you do that, that's got to be your number one step, to sit there and go, hey, does this make sense? Why would I need to put my password in here to get a document? Typically, if it's coming from a secure link, it's going to ask you for a second factor to kind of chime in there, or it's going to ask you to create a new password if you're going into someone else's share file or environment. So before you click that, have those questions. Or if you're getting those changes to banking details, especially in this audience, no one changes banking details in an email anymore, no matter how urgent of a situation is. If it's that urgent, I promise you, they're typically going to make a phone call, or they're going to come see you in person. They're not going to send you an email saying, hey, we're not doing, wires anymore, and now we want to do a payment this venue and change banks on a whim. They're not going to call you and tell you we've missed the last 3 payments and the remittance needs to happen there. So again, that employee training, making sure you're following those best practices. And then finally, I always tell folks that conditional access policies, restricting If your company doesn't travel and you can restrict IP geolocations to a specific area, that really reduces the ability for the threat actors to kind of leverage an attack that can get in there. And then the conditional access policies allow you to bind specific devices that are compliant in your environment to your credentials, so that if someone else gets your credentials and they're not using one of those devices, they're not able to then sign in without another method of authentication.
You know, Frank, that's another great segue, to start talking a little bit about like sort of getting in the weeds a little bit, and in particular, since there's a bunch of lawyers on this call, what provisions in a contract do you think are essential for managing cybersecurity risk with vendors and service providers?
I think I'm gonna snatch that from Frank.
Okay.
Okay, so I think, so there's a few things. It depends on what jurisdiction you're in. There could be some prescribed elements, but I think it's really important, one, that you have a vendor risk management process. Are you vetting? Do you have assessments? Are you scoring people? Are you getting information around the worthiness of these entities to be able to house, protect, and access the data that you are the steward of? And then in those contracts, we want to make sure that we're getting their technical organizational measures that they have in place, that they're going to be bound to. Third parties have sub-processors, so we want to be able to bind them to their subcontractors, their sub-processors, to keep and protect the data in the same way that they are bound. We want to have options to object those sub-processors. So there needs to be a process around there. There needs to be important around, if they identify a breach, an actual incident, that they have an obligation to respond to us, to notify us within 72 hours or sooner. 72 hours is it's standard for a lot of contracts because of GDPR. It makes sense, but it's enough time. But we also, you want to put that in there explicitly. And you want to be clear about what they can do with the data. You want to know where the locations are, because again, you need to manage your own program, and you need to be able to know where your customer's data is, even when you trust it with a third party. Where are they operating? Where are they keeping it? And they should have that information. A lot of folks are using AWS. Which ones? What locations? Where is it located? So that you can track that. You want to know whether, and this is part of your own mapping, so this is outside the contract, but your own vendor risk management. You want to know what data they have, because there are some vendors that only have name and email addresses. Absolutely, we want to protect all the data. But if they have a breach and all they have is name and email addresses, I feel way better about that disclosure than if they're holding some sensitive data around. And you want to know that so you can weight these different entities and know, and they can help you with your audits, with your follow-up, with your certification. You want to be able to have audit rights. You want to be able to hold them to giving you certifications. You want them to have to help you with your own risk assessment that you have to do. So those are kind of like the basic things. You want to hold them to a very high standard, and you want them to limit the data, you want them to safeguard it, and you want to be able to audit them as needed.
And so, Frank, what do you see with respect to vendors and third parties and the cyber issues that originate from their problems?
Yeah.
That's a whole ball of wax that, kind of spins off on a few different directions, because it starts with the contract, as Kimberly was just attesting to, right? Some vendors are just strictly there to provide day-to-day operations and no level of security, even though the company felt like that, no, I hired you as a company to provide my IT support, and they just assumed that was what was being provided because they deployed out some security tools. So it all starts with that contract and that agreement you're making with the organization, moving into that engagement and relationship. And then it's going through, as we just discussed with, we'll keep kicking back to these incident response plans and rehearsals, but it goes back through making sure that they're looped into those tabletops and those exercises as you're going through to determine who's going to be doing what or when. We did see, historically last year with some issues with a third-party remote access tool that was being leveraged by threat actors that many MSPs use to provide services to their clients. So because of this, they were, de facto engaged on incident responses because they allowed access into customers' networks via their tool that they bought from a third party. So, it gets very specific when you're reviewing those contracts, and it's all going to start with what you're hiring this individual to do, working with your counsel to sit there and say, hey, let's review this contract, but more specifically, let's review it from a securities perspective. Are we buying what we think we're buying? Are they providing what they are providing? And in the event something happens, who is responsible for this and what is their responsibility? You may not necessarily want them running the investigation on the back end of it. Or typically your insurance carrier or your outside counsel may not want you having them run it because of some of those conflicts that inherently may come up during the response. And I'm sorry, Ernie, I stepped over you, sir.
No problem. Because it's like at my advanced age, unless I ask the question right away, I forget. And really, what I was going to get at, Frank, was most of the major data breaches that have actually occurred through third parties or vendors, not exactly the system. Have you seen any way of? The best way I can describe it is maybe a redundancy. Have you seen companies try to put in redundancies so that even when they have to interface with these vendors and third parties, buy their services and everything, that they're able to still protect themselves?
Sometimes it's so deep, your data is just out there, and so it's really those hard level reviews, and it's not realistic to expect you to be reviewing the security practices for AWS that a vendor is then using to house the data that you're providing. You're 3 layers deep at that point. So think of most of your cloud-based payroll type information. They're leveraging a lot of APIs, automatic program interceptions, where they're providing that data, where there's a potential for leakage of data through those. And it's not a realistic expectation for a company buying into that service to look through that. So that's really where you have to leverage the reputation, leverage those contracts, and really dive deep into those contracts to make sure that you understand that they are SOC 2 compliant, that they have been tested, that they are auditable, so that you can sit there and provide an external audit to say, hey, is my data safe? Because it's your data. That's exactly what this vendor is going to tell you, is it's not their data, it's their service, and it's your data.
But of course, what you don't want is either to say, well, we've taken a leap of faith. That's why you keep referring back to the contractual language to at least have something there to make sure that there's protected. Kimberly, we've sort of touched upon this a little bit, but if I were to play music right now, it would be some ominous, like, music from Star Wars, like the Death March, the Imperial Death March or whatever, because now we have to turn to the SEC. And so what's the SEC looking for in these situations that, Frank was talking about?
Sure. I think I also want to add one other thing to what was being said. I think with third-party risk management, it is very important because so many critical, mission critical, business critical operations are really reliant upon third-party technology. And organizations need to know that about their operations. They need to know who are the entities that they can't pay payroll. That's a big deal. So if you did an exercise, like if you could not pay payroll, how would you pay your employees? Because a lot of employees are not going to stick around. It's going to be a hard negotiation if people aren't getting paid, right? So really knowing what things are really outsourced that are really important is very important. So when you're going through this risk management, because you can't do it all, because there's so many third parties that people doing small things, big things, but you really want to be tapped in and tuned into what those large organizations are and what the impact can be. Okay, and so to your point about the SEC coming in. So listen, the SEC puts out deficiencies, they put out observations around what they might have seen. They don't do it all the time, but they are reoccurring. And one of the biggest things that I think we should note is people who do not tailor their incident response plans. They have commented on incident response plans still having blanks left in the plans, which shows that you have not completed the plan. You have not gone through it. You just bought it right out of the box. And it's really important, even if you start with one and you're going to tailor it, it really needs to be tailored to your business. It really needs to be completed, and it really needs to be exercise so that it can be appropriate for your business and how things will happen. And just to have one to check the box does not work. Institutions that have reoccurring things that happen and they don't adjust the technology. So if some bad actor came in and took a customer's account and it was flagged and then they were able to do it again, and those kind of things get flagged. Entities that are not doing pen testing, those institutions that are not able to demonstrate that they are monitoring and they have good practices in place to detect whether the program is working as it's supposed to. Having the right leaders involved, right? Like who knows what, who's been designated to do things. And I think, making sure that you have a program. So this is not just about paperwork. This is about having a program around these important issues, a program that is looked at, that is revised, that is tested over time, that is looked at to see if it is working. Are things being detected? Do you have a vulnerability program? Are scans being done? And when things are identified, are you addressing the things that have been identified? That is another big myth that Frank alluded to earlier, because we will have documentation around things that we've already noted that are not protecting the data in the way that we would expect and that the regulators would expect in a way that our customers wouldn't expect. So we really want to make sure that when we're getting these punch lists that they're being acted upon. And so these does take investment. It takes time investment. It takes money investment. And I know in a lot of organizations, the securities budget is higher than legal's often, but and it's for good reason, right? Because these things really do impact your ability to do business over time. Because one, you may lose customers because of loss of trust. You may get fines that really hinder your ability to operate and things like that. And so we really want to be thoughtful about actually meeting and not just checking a box, but actually meeting the spirit of what some of these regulations are getting to. And it's super important for all these institutions to be able to adhere to that, to actually do business and to remain in business for a great length of time.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And look, when you're dealing with government regulators, and Kimberly makes a great point, they don't even need to just say blanks in the procedure manual. I remember I had an investigation with the SEC one time where it's required that broker dealers and their registered reps, affirm every year that they've read and understand the compliance manual. Well, this firm had a digital way of tracking that. You just go online and you'd look through the thing and you'd click it. And what was happening was the SEC, when they came in for their annual exam, asked for the digital backup for this particular program. And what they didn't tell people was that, the computer can actually determine how long you were looking at something. So the SEC asked for that, and they determined that of the 100 people that reviewed this and certified that they understood it and looked at it, spent an average of about 9 seconds actually looking at it. And of course, they cited the firm for not having the appropriate procedure in place and certifying it when it's impossible to read a 100-page manual. And the same goes through for these types of preparedness plans. Kimberly, what about it's not only the SEC and American regulators, but it's also others, when it comes to data privacy laws and investment compliance. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I will, but I want to continue to add on something you said. That is going to be my way of doing things, apparently. But you hit on something that was very important, because that's why we have to design these things to be appropriate. So maybe you wouldn't just have a sign off, maybe you have a training. Even if it's a 10-minute training, at least they looked at it. Maybe you summarize and have slides and people sign up on those. So you do those steps. I think the other thing that's really important is, I didn't talk about, is access management controls. I mean, this comes up often where employees have left and their access is still live and still active, right? And maybe part of some breach, or that employee used the same details somewhere else, and they are really doing credential stuffing, right? Where they are looking and finding things, and those kind of things are also really red flags that people need to look at. And so then also just thinking about, to your point, to me, your new question is around, there's a lot of things that you may have to comply with. So if you happen to be large and processing the data and don't have an exemption on the GOBA, you may have state privacy laws. GDPR does not care that the SEC is here, right? GDPR has their own laws and they have requirements around this stuff, which a lot of it is aligned. You have New York city, right, with their own cybersecurity reporting laws. And then if you have an incident, all 50 states have their own data breach notification laws. Absolutely all of them, including the territories. They have their own. And so there is a lot to comply with. And so it's really important that you have a team already available to you. So as you're seeing, as the incident is unfolding and you're able to identify whether sensitive customer information is impacted, or for other laws that you maybe have to apply to, just personal data, right? Like, what is it that what was part of the incident, what was disclosed, what was a part of it, so that we can see what things are covered and then what your notification obligations are, because you could have many, and depending on the state, some states you have to report to the AG, some AGs you only have to report if you hit a certain threshold. But that's a lot of patchwork to do, but you want to make sure you're compliant. You want to make sure your notification letters are compliant with every regulation that you have to comply with, because they have different language, because they don't make it easy for us, because we do not have the benefit in the US of federal privacy laws, of federal data protection law. And so the SEC is streamlining some things, but you still may have to comply with other laws. And I think the main thing is, if you are committed to a framework, whatever that is, a reputable framework, if that's NIST, if that's, SOC, if that's, some other ISO something, right? If you commit to a framework and then you work that framework, if you meet that framework, you're getting audited around that framework, you're more than likely around that space going to comply with all the laws, because they don't prescribe a certain framework. But once you do adhere to one and you actually are meeting the standards of those frameworks, then you're in a good position. Nothing's going to be perfect, because the bad actors are more creative and they have a lot of time. But what we want to do is just really build a good foundation that will give us at least a lot of detection when they get in it. I know Frank and I worked on a matter with a municipality that, the bad actor got in. They were in there for 46 minutes. Like, you don't want them in. But if they get in and they're in for 46 minutes, don't access anything, doesn't get to download anything, that's the best case scenario of a worst scenario, right? So there was ended up being no notification, but it was because they had good detection systems. They adhered to the detection system. So even if you're using a service, but the right people aren't getting the notifications, or maybe you're getting too many notifications, and so you're not reading them, you're not noting them, those are the kind of things you need to work out so that you can be responsive and that you can be proactive to prevent incidents, and also, in this case that incident is happening, to mitigate it and remediate it swiftly.
And Kimberly, if I can, we've just come full circle. We're going back to exactly almost what we started with, having the proper procedures in place and controls in place. It all really is dependent upon that handles all of what you're talking about.
Yes, it does. And it is very important. And I also want to emphasize that small entities are targets. I think there's this myth that bad actors are only looking at large companies. I mean, large companies are getting attacked. If they have to report how many attacks they're getting daily, they are in the 100,000s daily. But the cyber criminals are making a lot of progress with small entities, because it's low-hanging fruit for them, because you may not have the right controls in place, because you don't think you're on the radar. And so it's really important that, as a course of doing business, that you adhere to these types of programs, and that you have these procedures and these processes and these controls in place, and that they are robust, and that you are improving them best you can regularly.
And one of the things that I think is important, and I hope for our audience, and that, Kimberly, it's something you just said, is that it's not only, like, for example, law firms apparently are in the crosshairs of a lot of these hackers, accounting firms, large accounting firms, but even smaller accounting firms. And of course, we just heard this week, or actually late last week, about the potential that there was a Russian hack of our federal court system. So it's like it's on so many different levels from so many different, I know I've been involved in several investigations that didn't even involve a state actor. It involved sort of economic corporate espionage. So it's not just, it's not just the bad people come in all different shapes and forms, and they don't just look to the big multinational corporations. They're looking to, like, everybody.
Right. And the other thing that insider threat. So your employees inadvertent incidents happen all the time. And so that training, that's another thing that I think the SEC looks for, adequate training around these for your staff members, because they are the ones most likely to hit that phishing link. They are most likely to be tricked by a bad actor's email. And some of these bad actors, to Frank's point, they have gotten really good. We've heard about the deep fakes that looked just like the CEO. So they thought, I'm on the video with them. And so, these things are getting very sophisticated. And so really having robust multi-system ways, multi-approvals, so they'd have to trick a lot of people, right? And they have to overcome a number of things to get into places that we've decided are critical. And so that's why it's important that you have that map around your program, around what's critical, what are approvals, what kind of things around finances and payments happen, right? What kind of robustness do we need around certain mission critical systems is really, really important. And it's worth the exercise of looking through them. And it can be hard because the technology that we use is so much technology. The tech stacks that companies, even a small company using, is a long list. But knowing what they are and what they hold, and I won't even start talking about legacy systems. Please deal with your legacy systems. People just think turning them off, but they're sitting there, they're dormant, they are not getting security updates, so they become risk to you. So you want to be really thoughtful not to keep data in systems that you no longer need. And you want to be able to make sure that you're limiting the data once you need it, you don't need it anymore. There's a hoarding thing that happens, but if you have data that you don't need, particularly sensitive customer information that you do not need, that is old, that is expired, so that's when very good retention and deletion programs come into play, right, too. So that's all a part of the business programs, right? And then you want to stress test around your business continuity and things like that. And so there's a lot of work to do around this. And so I'm very happy to help people. We should have jobs, Frank and I, but we really want to empower those who join the call to really be thoughtful about their own programs and making sure that they're being very diligent, because it is worthwhile, the investment of time and money.
I do want to point out one thing that we haven't touched upon. That's because we have a separate coffee chat series panel on AI, which also plays into this, and AI is being used very much here. I want to open it up to the panel, to the attendees, to see if they have any questions before I go to last remarks from Kimberly and Frank. Are there any questions that you may have out there? I feel like I should do the Jeopardy thing, Jeopardy, one of the things we may need to do, like, is, sort of like to enhance the audio visual experience, in the future, but
Get a wheel with the attendee's name and just spin it and pick somebody.
Exactly. Frank, why don't we get some last words from you while we're waiting if there's any questions?
Look, I don't want everyone to come away from this call and be like, oh gosh, we're never going to make it. The key point is being proactive about facing these threats and not letting it scare you into a corner and just burying your head. The reason so many advocates on this call are prescribing, hey, get ahead of this early, is because unfortunately, day in and day out, we're seeing clients who wait until the bad things already happened to then make it a priority. And so that's always my biggest point of view when we do a more proactive consulting call, is to highlight that, it's, I hate saying it's a cost thing, but I promise it's going to be cheaper to address this beforehand than after the hand, because it really is. And it is an investment, but it's an investment to allow your company to be more successful. And many of these times when you come through and you plan a tabletop, you build your incident response plan, you're identifying issues in organization within your company that's already existed. And by fixing those organizational issues, it's going to make you more secure, and it's going to make your business more effective, and it's going to prepare you for a potential incident so that you're more secured and less at risk moving forward.
Kimberly, what do you think? Last words.
Yeah, I think while we did describe something that sounds daunting, and in some ways it is, I do think, taking the very proactive steps and preventative steps that we've kind of outlined here today is really what helps on the end, that when the thing happens, when the regulator looks back, when we're at the court, when there's lawsuits, did you act reasonably, right? And so this helps build up that you did all, all the things that are reasonable to be able to protect. You acted, swiftly when it happened. You were able to remediate. Like all those things happen from practice, from having a program, from having a tested, robust program, and to exercise it on a regular basis, to engage as many people around it that's appropriate. So that's with the training programs, that's with the phishing exercises that you have in-house. And to look at those numbers, if you do the phishing exercise and everybody fails, then you need to hone in on that because you now have new information. And so every time you get a new bit of information, it's really important that you act proactively with that information. So now maybe trainings are required. There's some other things that might need to take place, and you need to know that you are at risk because your employees are very susceptible to engaging with these bad actors. So that may mean you may put more restrictions on your emails, and the filters go up higher, right? And so more emails are going into spam, whatever it is that you may decide to do to be able to address the information that you're getting from being proactive and from exercising all those and stress testing the programs and the things like that. And I think the last thing to say is that there are, partners that you may have, right? Your law firm is here to help in a preventative way, connecting you with the right, tools and other vendors. And we work in partnership with others like P&G Cyber to make sure that you are in the best shape to weather these types of unfortunate incidents that happens to the best of them.
Frank and Kimberly and Frank, you guys have so put it in so succinctly and everything. It's like start early, plan, test, continue to do it. It's a constant evolving organic process, and just don't forget about it. Well, I just want to, tell everybody it concludes our coffee chat session today. We want to thank Kimberly and Frank for participating as panelists. And we want to thank you in particular for joining us. We hope you found today's discussion informative and you'll join us for our future sessions. We'll send you those invitations in your email boxes. Hopefully it'll get through your spam folder. Our next coffee chat is scheduled for next Tuesday, August 26th, where we will be discussing cross-border securities investigations. If you have any questions or would like more information, please feel free to reach out to us directly, in particular, Kimberly and Frank. As you can tell, they love to talk about this, and we loved having you here today and loved having everybody. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks, everybody. Kimberly, Frank, thank you guys so much. You were wonderful.
It's a pleasure as always, Ernie. Kimberly, see you next time.
All right.